He looked like a poor woodcutter with his daughter, barely able to stand on his feet from exhaustion. But she took a chance. She gave them a free dinner and felt her heart open for the first time. She didn't know that behind this silent man lay a secret that made even the richest people in town tremble. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun beat down over the little town as if determined to dry every drop of moisture from the earth. The streets were wide, but there was little in them beyond drifting dust. The occasional wagon creaking by with tired horses, and men whose boots left heavy prints in the sand. The air itself smelled of sweat, smoke, and iron, the scent of a place built on the backs of those who never stopped working. On the far end of the main street stood the saloon known as the Red Moon, its swinging doors clattering day and night as men came and went in search of drink, company, or a brief moment of escape. Inside, the light was dim, shaded by smoke from cigars that never seemed to go out. Glasses clinked, cards slapped against wooden tables, and rough laughter echoed in bursts. It was the heart of the town, but it was a heart that beat with restlessness rather than peace. And at the center of it most evenings was a young woman who worked tirelessly behind the counter. Clara had been working in the Red Moon for nearly 4 years. She was only 23, yet her life had already carved the weary lines of someone older. Her hair was the color of wheat at the end of a long summer, often tied back hastily to keep it from falling in her eyes. Her dress was plain, faded from too many washes, and her apron bore the inevitable stains of spilled whiskey and ale. Though she was small in frame, she carried herself with a steadiness that made even the roughest cowhands hesitate before making crude remarks in her presence. Her parents had died when she was little more than a girl, and the world had forced her to find her own place. She had no family left, no land, no dowry. What she had was her work, and she clung to it with quiet determination. The nights blurred into each other, the same faces, the same heavy air, the same drunken quarrels. Clara sometimes felt as though she was watching her own life from a distance, trapped in the monotony of pouring drinks and cleaning up after others. But what else was there? A woman on the frontier had little choice but to cling to what stability she could. The Red Moon gave her a roof over her head, a few coins at the end of the week, and just enough food to keep her strong. Still, in the small hours when the saloon emptied and silence fell, she often wondered if there was something more, some hidden part of the world waiting for her beyond these dusty streets. It was on such an evening, when the heat had finally given way to a dry chill and the lamps flickered against the smoky air, that a man pushed open the doors of the Red Moon and stepped inside. He was taller than most, his shoulders broad beneath a worn shirt, and his presence seemed to still the room for the briefest moment. His coat was old, patched in more than one place, and his boots carried the scars of long workdays. His hands were large and scarred, the kind of hands that belonged to someone who knew the weight of an axe and the endless drag of timber. He moved quietly, without the swagger of the cowboys or the loud complaints of the miners. He simply crossed the room, ordered a single drink in a voice roughened by dust and silence, and settled into a corner as though hoping to disappear. Clara noticed him because he was different. Men who came into the saloon usually sought attention, boasting, drinking, shouting over one another, as if the louder they were, the more alive they became. But this man seemed carved from another world. He drank slowly, his gaze steady on the table in front of him, his expression unreadable. She carried the glass to him herself, and when he lifted his eyes to thank her, she caught a glimpse of something she rarely saw in men here: quiet exhaustion that spoke of endless responsibility. She did not know his name, but already she felt a pull of curiosity toward him. As the night deepened, Clara noticed something else. Through the open doorway, just visible on the saloon steps, sat a little girl. She was small, perhaps no more than 6, her dark hair tangled beneath a sun-bleached bonnet. In her hands she clutched a doll made of cloth scraps, its stitching loose, its face faded from handling. Her dress was patched, her feet bare, and she watched the people passing by with eyes too solemn for a child. Clara's heart clenched. The men in the saloon laughed and cursed, spilling drinks and making wagers, while outside that girl sat silent, waiting. When the man rose to leave, Clara understood. He stepped outside and the girl immediately stood, her face brightening in the presence of her father. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, guiding her away from the saloon and down the dark street. For a moment Clara stood at the door, watching them fade into the shadows, her heart aching in a way she could not explain. The man had carried himself with a quiet strength, but it was the sight of the child that stayed with her through the night. The next evening and the evening after, he came again. Sometimes he stayed only long enough to drink a single beer, sometimes longer, always quiet. And always the little girl waited outside. Clara began to notice small details. The way he never touched his drink until he had glanced outside to be sure the child was still safe. The way his hands lingered on her shoulders when they walked away. The way he never spent more than a few coins. She began to feel a restless sympathy stirring inside her. One night, as she carried a tray past the doorway, she saw the girl sitting there again, her small body curled against the wooden post. Clara slipped into the kitchen, poured a glass of milk, and cut a thick slice of bread. When she stepped outside and offered it to the child, the girl looked up in surprise, her eyes wide and hesitant. Slowly, she reached out, taking the food with both hands. Her voice was so soft, Clara almost did not hear it. "Thank you." Clara smiled, her heart swelling as she watched the child nibble at the bread. She did not ask questions, for she knew that kindness, given without condition, was the only kind worth giving. Later that evening, when the man rose to leave, Clara slipped a piece of pie into the paper wrapping with his drink. He noticed, of course. His gaze lingered on her as he accepted the package, and for the first time his lips curved into a faint smile. No words passed between them, yet in that exchange, something fragile was born, a silent recognition, a spark of connection between two people who had learned to live in solitude. That night, as Clara swept the floor of the empty saloon, she found herself thinking not of the rowdy gamblers or the loud arguments she had broken up, but of the quiet man and his little girl. She wondered where they lived, what their days were like, how they managed in a world that left so little for those without wealth or standing. She wondered what it must feel like to work until your body ached, only to give everything to a child whose smile was your only reward. And as she thought of that child's solemn eyes lighting up over a glass of milk, she felt a warmth she had not known in years. In the days that followed, the routine of the town continued. The dust, the sweat, the endless clamor of men trying to drink away their failures. But for Clara, something had shifted. She began to look toward the door each evening, waiting for the moment when it would open and the tall man would step inside. She began to notice the way her own heart lifted when she saw him, the way her thoughts strayed to the little girl sitting outside. She did not yet understand what this feeling meant. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her life had not been the same since the night he first walked into the red moon. And somewhere beyond the silence of her days, beyond the dust and the smoke and the endless repetition, Clara felt the stirring of a hope she had long thought dead. The days that followed slipped by with the same dust-filled rhythm that had always carried the town forward. But something within Clara had changed since the evening she first offered a glass of milk and bread to the child outside the red moon. She no longer moved through her shifts with the same detached composure. Instead, her thoughts drifted more often than not toward the tall woodsman who came at night and the little girl who waited faithfully on the steps. Each evening, as the lamps were lit and the air inside thickened with smoke and noise, Clara found herself listening for the creak of the saloon doors, hoping for the quiet presence that had begun to color her days with a strange, unexpected anticipation. The man's name, she eventually learned, was Jacob. No one in the town seemed to know him well. He lived at the edge of the forest that spread beyond the hills, alone with his daughter in a weathered shack, and his work was as plain as it was brutal. He was a lumberman, one of the few who could spend dawn to dusk cutting down trees and hauling timber without the aid of a crew. His days were carved from sweat, wood chips, and silence, and though many men in town made their living by strength, Jacob seemed of another sort, unyielding, disciplined, yet softened by the care with which he guided his daughter wherever she went. Clara heard fragments of gossip about him. Some said he kept to himself because he was proud. Others that grief had hollowed him out long ago. But for Clara, none of those rumors mattered. What she saw was a man who carried his burdens with dignity and gave what little joy he had to his child. Her small kindnesses to them began to grow, almost without her noticing. At first, it was only a slice of pie or a warm drink slipped into the packet Jacob carried out into the night. But soon Clara found herself seeking ways to make the little girl's waiting less lonely. On quiet evenings, when the saloon's noise had not yet reached its peak, Clara would step outside with a sweet, a story, or a question meant to coax a smile from the child. The girl's name was Lily, and though shy at first, she warmed quickly to the young woman who spoke to her as if she were more than a shadow at the door. They shared small secrets. Clara told her about birds she had once seen nesting in the rafters, about wildflowers that grew near the creek in spring, about stars that seemed to fall across the sky in showers when she was a little girl. Lily, in turn, showed her drawings she scratched with bits of charcoal on scraps of paper, mostly suns with long crooked rays or stick figures holding hands. Sometimes she laughed at Clara's silly stories, and that laughter, light and unguarded, carried into the saloon and reached Jacob's ears, softening his weary expression. Jacob watched these exchanges quietly. Though he rarely spoke more than was necessary, Clara could see the change in his eyes when Lily smiled. He seemed to carry less of the world's weight in those moments, as though he, too, was reminded of something gentle and rare. Once, when Clara handed Lily a biscuit along with a ribbon she had saved from a dress long since worn through, Jacob lingered a moment longer than usual when collecting his drink. He looked at Clara as though searching for words he could not quite find, and in that glance she felt the depth of his gratitude, wordless though it was. Yet not everyone approved of these quiet gestures. The Red Moon was a place of harsh judgments and sharper tongues, and soon whispers began to circle. Some of the regulars noticed the way Clara's attention drifted toward the quiet man in the corner, how she slipped him more than he paid for. They laughed among themselves, making crude jokes about her charity, about the foolishness of wasting kindness on a man who had nothing to give in return. More than once Clara overheard their remarks, the sting sharp in her chest. One evening her employer himself warned her. He was a heavy-set man, grizzled from years of running the saloon, and he told her bluntly that no good would come of entangling herself with a penniless woodsman dragging a child behind him. "A girl like you," he said, "could find herself a miner with pockets full of gold, or a cattleman with land. Don't throw yourself away on someone with nothing but blisters to his name." Clara listened, nodded as was expected, but inside she bristled. What did these men know of worth, of what it meant to give and to receive without calculation? The truth was, she could not explain even to herself why she felt drawn to Jacob. Perhaps it was the silence he carried with him, so different from the clamor of the others. Perhaps it was the way he treated his daughter, with a gentleness rare in a place where men often saw children as burdens rather than blessings. Or perhaps it was simply the way she felt less alone when he was near, as though their separate solitudes recognized each other and found comfort in the meeting. Whatever the reason, Clara's resolve only deepened as others tried to dissuade her. The more the town whispered, the more she chose to show kindness openly, even defiantly. One evening after a long day when the saloon had emptied later than usual, Clara found Jacob lingering by the counter as Lily dozed in a corner. The air was quieter, the noise gone, and in the hush he spoke more than she had ever heard before. He thanked her, not only for the food she had given, but for the way she spoke to his daughter, the way she made the child laugh. His voice was low, hesitant, as though unaccustomed to such confessions, and in it Clara heard not just gratitude, but something heavier, almost sorrowful. He admitted that since the death of his wife, he had not believed himself capable of offering his daughter joy. He had thought his life reduced to survival alone. Yet here, in the glow of Clara's small acts of kindness, he saw a light he had long thought extinguished. Clara listened in silence, her own heart tightening at his words. She told him softly that burdens were never meant to be carried alone, that sometimes the smallest gestures could make the heaviest loads bearable. As she spoke, she reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against his hand on the counter. For a moment he froze as though startled by the contact. Then his eyes met hers. In that instant, unspoken truths passed between them, about loss, about loneliness, about the fragile hope of connection. Neither said more, but when he left that night with Lily's small hand tucked in his own, Clara knew that something had shifted between them, subtle yet undeniable. The town, of course, noticed even more. The whispers grew sharper, and Clara endured them with quiet strength. But inside she felt a warmth growing, a fragile but persistent flame that no ridicule could extinguish. She had seen Jacob as more than the worn clothes and scarred hands. She had seen the father who sacrificed everything for his child, the man who carried silence like a wound, the soul who had not forgotten how to care. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she would not turn away. The nights at the Red Moon continued, the laughter and the quarrels, the endless noise of men chasing fortune or drowning failure. Yet for Clara, each evening carried with it a new anticipation, a hope that Jacob would return, that Lily would smile, that their presence would once again remind her that even in the harshest of places, kindness could bloom. She did not yet dare to name what was forming between them, but she felt it as surely as she felt the beat of her own heart. And so the days slipped into nights, and the nights into days, with a quiet affection weaving its way into their lives, unremarked by most, but growing nonetheless into something neither of them could ignore. The days grew heavier with the weight of things unsaid, and though Clara tried to hold on to the warmth that had blossomed between her and Jacob, a tension began to weave its way into the rhythm of their quiet bond. The town itself seemed restless, as if sensing that something was about to shift. Beyond the dusty streets and the crowded saloon, there were other forces at work, forces that neither Clara nor Jacob could ignore for long. Whispers of new men coming into town reached Clara's ears. Rough-looking riders who wore the emblem of the lumber company, men who carried themselves not like workers, but like enforcers. It did not take long for her to learn why they had come. The owner of the lumber mill, a man named Silas Hardin, had returned to town after months away. Hardin was known for his wealth and his ruthlessness, a man who turned trees into gold by breaking the backs of those desperate enough to swing an axe for pennies. Jacob's independence had long been a thorn in his side. While most woodsmen bent under Hardin's contracts, signing away their land and their freedom for the promise of steady pay, Jacob refused. He lived simply, cut his own trees, sold his own timber. That defiance infuriated Hardin. Men like Jacob reminded the town that it was still possible to live without chains, and Hardin could not abide such reminders. The first warning came quietly. Two of Hardin's men appeared one morning at Jacob's shack on the edge of the forest. They leaned against the fence, spitting tobacco and smiling with cold, sharp eyes. They offered him a contract already filled out, promising money if he would sell his rights to the stretch of land he cut from. Jacob's refusal was calm but unyielding. He told them plainly that his land was his own, that his work was his own, and that he would bow to no master. The men laughed and left, but their parting words lingered like smoke in the air. Everyone bends sooner or later. You'll see. When Clara saw Jacob that evening, there was a shadow over him that she had not seen before. He drank slower than usual, his eyes distant, his shoulders tense. Lily played near the counter, drawing crooked suns on a scrap of paper Clara had given her, but Jacob hardly seemed to notice. Clara waited until the saloon thinned before speaking, her voice gentle, asking if something had happened. He hesitated, then told her. She felt her chest tighten as she listened. She knew what Hardin was capable of. Everyone in town did. He had ruined families before, driven men into debt so deep they had no choice but to sell everything they owned and leave with nothing but shame. And now his gaze had fallen on Jacob, who had nothing left to lose but the child who depended on him. The trouble did not take long to follow. Within a week, Hardin's men began spreading their presence inside the Red Moon, their voices loud, their threats disguised as jokes. Clara heard them whisper Jacob's name more than once, heard the mocking tone in which they spoke of the woodsman and his stubborn pride. One night, when Jacob walked in and took his usual seat, two of Hardin's enforcers leaned against the bar and sneered loudly about how some men were too stupid to know when they were beaten. Clara's hands tightened around the bottle she was holding. She wanted to tell them to leave, but she knew the danger of such men. They thrived on intimidation, on making their targets feel small. Yet Jacob did not flinch. He drank his beer in silence, though Clara saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked to Lily sitting by the door. His silence was not weakness. It was restraint, born of a father's instinct to protect. But Hardin's men were not content with silence. They began turning their cruelty toward Clara, taunting her for her kindness to Jacob, making crude remarks about a barmaid's foolish heart. The jeers grew sharper, louder, until one night one of them leaned too close across the counter, sneering that she must enjoy giving away her favors to a man who could never repay them. Before Clara could react, Jacob was on his feet. The sound of his chair scraping across the wooden floor cut through the laughter like a blade. He crossed the room in 2 strides and shoved the man back from the counter, his voice low but fierce, as he told him to leave her be. The room fell silent, tension thick as smoke. The man sneered, called him a fool, and in the next breath fists flew. The saloon erupted. Jacob was not a man who sought violence, but when pressed he fought with the strength of someone who had spent his life wielding an axe. His blows landed solid, driven by years of toil, but Hardin's men were many, and soon they overwhelmed him. Clara cried out as Jacob was struck down, fists and boots battering him until he staggered, blood running from his lip. Still, he did not yield. He rose again, shielding Clara and Lily with his body, fighting until at last the men were pulled back by others before the saloon could be reduced to ruin. They left with curses on their lips, promising that it was not over, that the woodsman would pay for his defiance. The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob stood, swaying, his breath ragged, his body bruised, but his spirit unbroken. Clara rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she guided him into a chair, tears stinging her eyes at the sight of his pain. That night, when the saloon finally emptied and the lamps burned low, Clara tended to his wounds in the quiet back room. She bathed the cuts on his face, bound his bruised knuckles with strips of cloth. Jacob sat still, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if ashamed to let another see his weakness. Yet when Clara's hand brushed his cheek, urging him to meet her eyes, something within him shifted. He spoke haltingly, words spilling out like confessions long held. He told her of the night his wife died, of the silence that had consumed his home, of the promise he had made to a dying woman that their daughter would never be left alone. He admitted his fear that all his labor, all his pain, might never be enough to shield Lily from the world's cruelty. And as he spoke, his voice broke. Not with anger, but with despair, the kind of despair that claws at a man in the dark when no one is watching. Clara listened, her heart breaking for him. She had known loss, too. She had known hunger and loneliness and the cruel indifference of the world. But as she looked at Jacob, she saw not only his pain, but the strength beneath it, the love that kept him standing when any lesser man would have fallen. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, her fingers closing gently around his scarred palm. He looked down at their joined hands in wonder, as though it had been years since another's touch had reached him. In that moment, without words, Clara gave him what he had long been denied: companionship, the simple assurance that he was not alone. When the silence stretched, Clara spoke softly. She told him that he did not have to fight this battle alone, that there were ways to stand against Hardin's cruelty. Jacob shook his head, weary, certain that one man could not overcome such power. But Clara's resolve was fierce. She had lived her whole life beneath the weight of other people's choices, and she would not let Hardin destroy the only man she had ever seen stand so unflinchingly for what was right. She suggested something bold, organizing a gathering, a night when the town could come together to support Jacob, to raise money, to show Hardin that not everyone could be bought or bullied. At first Jacob resisted, unwilling to accept charity, his pride bristling. But when Clara spoke of Lily, of the child who deserved a chance at a future not built on fear, his resistance faltered. For his daughter, he would endure anything, even the humility of accepting help. The decision was made in that dim back room, with Jacob's hand still held in Clara's, and the weight of the world pressing against the walls. They would fight, not with fists or rage, but with unity, with the quiet strength of those who believed in something more than profit and power. Clara felt her heart swell with a mixture of fear and hope. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, that Hardin would not relent. But she also knew that she had found in Jacob a cause worth standing beside. For the first time in years, her life felt not just like survival, but like purpose. And so the stage was set. Hardin's threats hung over them like storm clouds, but beneath those clouds a flame had been lit. one that neither intimidation nor violence could easily snuff out. Clara and Jacob would face what came together, bound not just by circumstance, but by the fragile, growing bond that had begun to take root between them. The town was about to learn that even in a place where power spoke loudest through guns and money, there was a different kind of strength born of love, of sacrifice, of the refusal to bend. And though neither of them yet dared to speak it aloud, Clara and Jacob both felt that they were no longer just two solitudes adrift in a harsh world. They were something more, and Hardin would soon discover just how dangerous that could be. The days after the fight in the Red Moon carried the sharp edge of unease, as though the whole town was holding its breath. Hardin's men lingered in the streets, watching, whispering, letting their presence remind everyone that defiance had a cost. Jacob worked the forest as he always did, but his steps were heavier, his eyes wary, and Clara could feel the weight he carried whenever he came into the saloon. She had seen him bloodied, had seen him bent but not broken, and in those hours when she had bound his wounds, she had realized something she had long been afraid to admit to herself. She loved him, not with the giddy infatuation of a girl, but with the deep, aching certainty of a woman who had found in him a mirror of her own endurance. Still, she did not speak it aloud. The world they lived in left little room for fragile words. Yet the bond between them grew all the same, not in declarations, but in the quiet way Jacob's gaze softened when he looked at her, in the way Lily ran to her now, with the unguarded joy of a child who had found another heart to trust. When Clara spoke of organizing a night for Jacob, a gathering where the town might come together, she had not fully known if such a thing was possible. But she began quietly, speaking first to the wives who came in for provisions, to the preacher's wife who had lost her brother to one of Hardin's debts, to the blacksmith whose sons had once worked under Hardin's contracts before fleeing with nothing. Slowly the idea spread. They would hold a night not of drinking and gambling, but of music, food, and giving. A night where people could remember what it meant to stand for one another. It was not easy. Fear was a powerful silencer, and Hardin's shadow reached far. But Clara had a way of speaking that made people believe, not because her words were grand, but because they came from the heart. She told them plainly that no man should have to fight alone when his only crime was to work hard and love his child. Jacob was reluctant, as she knew he would be. He hated the thought of standing in front of people, of accepting their charity. But when Clara placed her hand in his and reminded him of Lily, of the life that could be stolen from her if he gave in, his resistance faded. For his daughter, he said, he would swallow his pride. And so the night was set. Flyers written in hurried script were tacked to posts, word spread along the dusty streets, and the Red Moon began to prepare for something it had never known before, a night of unity instead of division. When the evening came, the saloon glowed with lantern light, its usual haze of smoke replaced by the scent of stew simmering in great pots, by the sound of fiddles tuning for music. Families came, not just men, but women and children, bringing baskets of bread, jars of preserves, coins wrapped in handkerchiefs. Clara moved among them with a nervous energy, her apron crisp, her eyes shining with a hope she dared not voice. Lily clung to her side, laughing as other children joined her near the corner, where drawings had been pinned to the wall. Jacob stood near the back at first, uncomfortable, uncertain, but slowly drawn forward as people approached him with nods, with quiet words of respect. For the first time in years, he was seen not as an outcast, but as a man worth standing beside. But Hardin's men had not forgotten, and they had not forgiven. Near the height of the evening, when the music rose and the laughter swelled, the doors swung open with a violence that silenced the room. Half a dozen riders stepped in, their faces hard, their hands resting on the grips of their pistols. The crowd froze, fear thick in the air. Clara's heart leapt to her throat as she saw them fan out, their leader's eyes locking on Jacob. They had come to break not just him, but the spirit of anyone who thought to defy Hardin's reach. The words they spoke were cruel, mocking the gathering as a fool's errand, declaring that the land would be taken whether Jacob agreed or not. When Jacob stepped forward, standing tall despite the bruises still fading on his face, the leader sneered and pushed him back, The movement was enough. In an instant, fists slammed against tables, chairs toppled, and the room erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked like thunder, glass shattered, screams filled the air. Clara dropped to the floor, pulling Lily into her arms as the child cried in terror. Through the smoke and the roar, she saw Jacob, fighting with a ferocity born not of anger but of love, throwing himself into the fray to protect what little he had left. The fight was desperate. Hardin's men had the advantage of weapons, but they did not have the town's heart. One by one, miners, farmers, and shopkeepers who had come to the gathering rose from their fear and joined the fight. The blacksmith swung a hammer, the preacher's son tackled one of the riders, and the saloon filled with the sound of defiance. Bullets struck wood, splintering beams, and the air thickened with smoke. But Jacob never faltered. He fought as if every blow was a promise to Lily, as if every strike was a vow that he would not let Hardin's cruelty win. Clara could hardly breathe, watching him through the haze, her hands tightening around Lily, as though her strength alone might shield the child. At last the tide turned. The riders, bloodied and beaten back, saw that they were outnumbered, that the town had chosen to stand. They retreated with curses, firing one last volley into the night before fleeing into the darkness. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breaths of those who remained. The red moon was scarred, tables splintered, glass shattered, but it still stood, and in its wreckage stood Jacob, battered but unbowed, his chest heaving, his eyes searching until they found Clara and Lily. He stumbled toward them, dropping to his knees, pulling them both into his arms. Clara pressed her forehead against his, tears mingling with the dust and blood on his skin. In that embrace, in the heat of survival, the truth between them no longer needed words. They had chosen each other. The days that followed brought change. Hardin's men did not return. Word spread quickly that the town had risen against him, that his power was not absolute. Without the loyalty of those he had ruled through fear, his grip loosened, and though he remained wealthy, he was no longer feared in quite the same way. Jacob's land was safe. He returned to his work in the forest, but now he did so with the knowledge that he was not alone. Clara no longer merely waited behind the saloon counter. She walked beside him, unashamed of the bond they had formed. The whispers of the town faded into acceptance, then into respect. For in a place where strength was measured in survival, theirs was a story that could not be mocked. It was a story of endurance, of love born in the harshest soil. Months passed, and the seasons shifted. The forest bloomed green again, and in the clearing near Jacob's shack, a small house began to take shape, built from the timber he cut with his own hands. Clara planted flowers along the edge, bright bursts of color against the rough wood. Lily ran laughing through the yard, her bare feet kicking up dust as she played, her ragged doll now replaced by others Clara had sewn. Evenings were filled with the smell of bread baking, with the sound of laughter drifting from the porch, with the quiet peace of lives no longer weighed down by solitude. Clara and Jacob sat side by side often, his hand around hers, her head resting against his shoulder, and in those silences they found more than words could ever say. The town did not change overnight. It remained a place of dust and struggle, of men seeking fortune and women scraping together survival. But for Clara, for Jacob, for Lily, it became something else as well. It became a home. The red moon still stood, but it no longer defined Clara's life. She carried within her the certainty that love could be carved even from the harshest wood, that kindness could survive even under the weight of cruelty. And Jacob, who had once thought his heart buried with his wife, now knew that love could be found again, not in the grand gestures of wealth or power, but in the simple constancy of a woman who had chosen to stand beside him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, Jacob sat on the porch with Clara and Lily. The air smelled of pine and earth, and the sound of cicadas hummed around them. Lily curled against Clara's side, already drifting toward sleep, and Jacob looked at them both with a quiet awe. He thought of the battles they had fought, of the blood spilled, of the moments when hope had seemed impossible. And then he thought of the laughter in Clara's voice, of the trust in Lily's smile, and he knew that everything he had endured had led him to this. He reached for Clara's hand, their fingers intertwining, and in the stillness he whispered the truth that had been written in his heart all along. He was no longer alone. The frontier remained harsh, the world still unforgiving. But for Jacob, for Clara, for Lily, the nights no longer belonged to solitude. They belonged to love, hard-earned and unbreakable, born beneath the gunfire of a saloon and nurtured in the quiet of a home that had once been only a dream. And in that truth, they found not just survival, but life. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful tales, and share this video with friends and family. Because some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.